Okay, I'm speaking to, very roughly, and I'm not going to say stuff which isn't in, two articles in the last two issues of the Weekly Worker in July, which are on this topic. Background to it, in the Euro elections, the CPGB called for a Labour vote, and this was controversial among comrades. I think partly controversial because we were not calling, we called for conditional support for no, we were willing to call for conditional support for candidates of the No to EU, Yes to Democracy platform if they were prepared to say no to Fortress Britain, let's have no immigration controls, free movement of labour, and if they were prepared to say yes to democracy, yes to the republic, republican democracy, and control from below, including, among other demands, popular militia and the right to bear arms. And this was controversial in CPGB, and one of the aspects which was controversial in CPGB, which is in fact actually a controversy much wider on the British left, is the British Labour Party still a, quote, bourgeois workers' party. Lenin's original tag seems to be bourgeois Labour Party, taken from Engels, says bourgeois Labour Party of the right wing of the trade unions in the 1890s. Yeah. Was this ever a correct characterisation? But assuming that it was ever a correct characterisation, has the Labour Party now gone so far to the right, so much become the creature of capital, that it has ceased to be in any sense a bourgeois workers' party? And if so, then the question arises, and I want to be very cautious about this. It's not uncommon for people, leftists in the United States, to say that the next step for the American left is the construction of a Labour Party, an independent Labour Party based on the trade unions. Yeah. And that is not a senseless idea in United States politics. I'm not saying it's the right idea, because I actually don't think it is the right idea for the left in the United States, because it's evading the question. The left in the United States is divided into even more tiny local sects, even more localised than the and tiny than the sects in Great Britain. You know? But in the first place, that's number one. Number two, it's not at all obvious, actually, that political dynamics in the United States would actually support the creation of a Labour Party. The nearest that the United States came, in the British sense, the nearest the United States came to independent political representation of Labour was the Socialist Party in the very early 20th century and into just after the First World War, and then the Communist Party in the in connection with the rise of the CIO in the 1930s and 40s, which rather suggests that actually the road to a mass workers' party in the United States is not through a Labour Party based on the trade unions. But that's an issue on one side. It's not stupid to say, let's create a Labour Party as a task of the left in the United States. It is, and it has been, this is not novelty. CPGB has been saying this since the time of Scargill's Socialist Labour Party. It is stupid and pointless for the left to say, let's create a new Labour representation committee, let's create a new Labour Party, let's create a new, quote, old Labour, because there already is a Labour Party in the UK. It's the Labour Party. The Labour Party has not become, like the United States Democratic Party, a party of one fraction of capital. Not to say that one fraction of capital doesn't, from time to different fractions of capital at various different times don't support the Labour Party for their own interests, but it is not foundationally a classical bourgeois party. So that's the fundamental point. It's not only opportunist to create a party which aims to recapitulate the Labour Party in some sense, whether it's Socialist Labour Party or Socialist Alliance or Republican Socialist Party as understood as a halfway house party, or Respect or No to EU. It's not just opportunist, it's just pointless and hopeless, and what you're going to get is get out of your laborism is absolutely negligible, political laborism is absolutely negligible results. If there is going to be a new Workers' Party in Britain which means something, it will have to involve a political break with laborism. And that political break with laborism in practice amounts to, whatever practical name you give such an organisation, that the party which you would have to create would be in substance communist. That is to say that it would be for the working class not merely being represented within bourgeois society, but taking over from bourgeois society. It would have to be for radical democracy, both within the party and positively subordinating the trade union officials, party officials, elected representatives, and within the society as a whole. And it would have to be for the international unity of, stand for the international unity of the working class, not for defending Britain's interests and class collaboration between capital and labour in order to maximise the defence of Britain's interests. Okay, so that's the background to this question, and the concrete question is the Labour Party, if it were the case that the Labour Party had turned into a British analogue of the Democratic Party, then it would still probably be a mistake, and an opportunist mistake, to try and build a new Labour Party in Britain. But nonetheless, it wouldn't be a stupid, senseless, dead-end attempt to occupy political space which doesn't exist. Which is what these various left unity projects, which pretend to be the old Labour in one way or another, or proposed Labourite policies in one way or another, have in practice been. So what does this expression bourgeois workers' party mean? I go in first place to the history of it. As I said, Engels characterised the right wing of the TUC, which was opposed to campaigning around the 8-hour day in the 1890s, as, quote, the bourgeois workers' party, whereas the socialist wing of the TUC, which wanted to campaign around the 8-hour day as part of the international movement, it was the 8-hour day campaign was one of the central early campaigns of the Second International. This was the non-bourgeois, as it were, the socialist wing, was the opponents of the, quote, bourgeois Labour Party. Then in 1917, I think it is 1917, Lenin writes an article called Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, which is using the theoretical arguments of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and developing them in some ways in a more explicit way. And in that context, Lenin revives this expression of Engels. And he says, once upon a time, Britain had a monopoly of colonies, and because Britain had a monopoly of colonies, it was only Britain which could have a bourgeois Labour Party. Now, imperialism has spread, and all the imperialist powers, by which he means really the great powers, he doesn't include Russia, for example, which could be said to be imperialist in a different sense. All the imperialist powers have their own bourgeois Labour parties. And where do these bourgeois Labour parties come from? The answer is because the super profits of imperialism allow the imperialist bourgeoisie to make concessions to what he says is a narrow layer, the aristocracy of labour. And the bourgeois Labour Party is based on the labour aristocracy. it's a bourgeois force within the workers' movement. He says there isn't that much difference between Arthur Henderson, who's a Labour Party leader, and David Lloyd George, who was a Liberal Party leader. Lloyd George, let's just find this quotation. Lloyd George is a first-class bourgeois manipulator, astute politician, and a popular orator who will deliver any speeches you like, even revolutionary ones, to a Labour audience, and a man who's capable of obtaining sizable sops for docile workers in the shape of social reforms, insurance, etc. Lloyd George serves the bourgeoisie splendidly and serves it precisely among the workers, brings its influence precisely to the proletariat where the bourgeoisie needs it most and where it finds it most difficult to subject the masses morally. And is there such a great difference between Lloyd George and the Scheidemans and Le Guiens, the right-wing leaders of the German social democracy, Hendersons and Heinemans, right-wing leaders of the British Labour movement, Plekhanovs, right-wing, at that time, leader of the Russian defensists, Renaudels, right-wing leader of the French Socialist Party, and co. So, the other side of this argument, on the one hand, there's the tendency of the bourgeoisie and the opportunists to convert a handful of very rich and privileged nations into eternal parasites on the body of the rest of mankind, to rest on the laurels of the exploitation of Negroes, Indians, etc., keeping them in subjection with the aid of excellent weapons of extermination provided by modern militarism. On the other hand, there is the tendency of the masses, who are more oppressed than before and who bear the whole brunt of imperialist wars, to cast off this yoke and overthrow the bourgeoisie. It's in the struggle between these two tendencies that the history of the labour movement, the workers' movement, will inevitably develop. Engels draws a distinction between the bourgeois Labour Party of the old trade unions, the privileged minority, and the lowest mass, the real majority, who are, and appeals to the latter, who are not infected by bourgeois respectability. This is the essence of Marxist tactics. So, applying this line, for example, the American Socialist Workers' Party in the 1980s, after having initially sent its members by turn, mostly ex-student members, into heavy industry on the basis that there were the working class was the working class in heavy industry, then came to the conclusion that the workers in heavy industry in the United States were a labour aristocracy, and that their workers should go and work in garment factories and other super exploited strata, because this was the way to go to the masses. So the idea of a bourgeois workers' party is essentially, we're talking about a party which is a party of the working class, which was created by the working class as an organ of struggle, but which is captured by the bourgeoisie making concessions to the aristocracy of labour, to the bureaucracy, and is therefore serves the interests of the bourgeoisie. And the phenomenon that it serves the interests of the bourgeoisie, the British Labour Party, in fact, became a mass party in the course of became a serious political, not a mass party, but a serious political actor in the course of 1914-18, because Henderson entered the War Cabinet, because trade unions leaders sat on co-management boards, and going along the side of that, in order to defend their immediate interest, the workers had to invent shop stewardism, to go round and outside the trade union leaderships, the Labour Party leadership, who were completely and utterly on board with the capitalist war effort. And the 1924 Labour government, when it came in, certainly did things which were at the same level of right-wing character. The 1924 Labour government unambiguously carried on imperialist wars, like Blair. The 1924 Labour government did not introduce major social welfare reforms. The Poor Law continued in existence. the 1924 Labour government attempted to manage budget deficits in ways which bore down on the working class. The Communist Party, it's a nice comment by, I haven't got a direct quotation, by Jack Lecky in 1924 in his critique of the draft programme of the Communist Party. He said that the Communist Party had been taken by surprise by the fact that the Labour government pursued a purely bourgeois policy which could perfectly well have been pursued by a Liberal government. The problem with Lenin's version of this, the theoretical underpinnings of Lenin's version of this, is simple and two-sided. Side one, the idea of the Labour aristocracy is seriously problematic. I'd say no more than seriously problematic. I'm not going to say hopeless, because the people who were the skilled workers, who were the hard core of the right wing, when Engels was writing, the railway unions, the miners' union, the engineers. By the early 20th century, these workers had come into harsh conflict with the employers and had become the hardcore of the left wing. And the miners in particular had been the hardcore of the right wing. In the formation of the British Communist Party, the South Wales miners were one of the core elements of the formation of the British Communist Party. So the idea of the Labour aristocracy is actually hopeless. In fact, it's also the case the other way round. It's very commonly the case that the workers who are the worst off, are the least well organised, are also the least militant and the most inclined to fall behind this or that right-wing demagogue or capitalist demagogue of one sort or another. So the Labour aristocracy theory is hopeless. Second off, if it were the case that the concessions which make possible the incorporation of a section of the workers' movement behind the bourgeoisie were only possible because of imperialism, then we should expect that there will be no bourgeois labour parties anywhere in the colonial world. Excuse me, I'm sorry, there are bourgeois workers' parties all through the Third World, anywhere where there is a sizable working class which has reached the point of creating organisations. Look at the Communist Party of India or the Communist Party of India Marxist. Look at the Workers' Party of Brazil. Look in the past, and I guess now too, at the Chilean Socialist Party. So the idea that the concessions only come from imperialist super-exploitation is a complete illusion. The reality is actually the assumption that concessions are only possible because of imperialist super-exploitation assumes, although Lenin doesn't use it elsewhere, it actually assumes Lassalle's iron law of wages. That is the idea that wages will tend towards subsistence levels, and it's only in exceptional cases that the working class can win more than subsistence levels. That's, of course, flatly contrary to there's a whole Marxist critique of Lassalle, Marxist arguments in relation to British trade unions and wages, price and profit, and so on and so forth. The working class can fight and it can win concessions. So how do we get this bourgeois workers' party phenomenon, taking it a level back? In the decline of feudalism, there are such things as bourgeois feudal organisations, bourgeois feudal corporations. The communes of the 12th and 13th century are organisations of the bourgeoisie, in modern terms of the petty bourgeoisie, but also including some people who are substantial employers of labour, particularly in shipping, which in a revolutionary way force themselves onto the stage of feudal society. The feudal elites attempt to suppress them by force. In some places they succeed in suppressing them by force. In other cases, however, they make concessions to them, and in the process of making concessions to them, they also incorporate them in the feudal state, which begins to develop more and more as a state bureaucracy, as a structured, centralized apparatus, in order to incorporate the urban corporations, in order to incorporate guilds, in order to incorporate monopoly trading companies. This process is contradictory. It's really important to grasp it's contradictory because the same is true of the bourgeois workers' party. It's contradictory because on the one hand, it is quite genuinely the case that the urban corporations in the final stages of feudal absolutism are an instrument of the absolutist state. And when the French Revolution comes along, it's necessary to overthrow all the urban corporations because they are simply instruments of the absolutist state. At the same time, it's also the case that the existence of the urban corporations, the existence of these concessions to the bourgeoisie, tends to denature and delegitimize the underpinnings of feudal authority, the idea that the only people who can rule are the landlords and the clerics. The feudal state becomes, in a peculiar sense, bourgeoisified, which people have, I think, mistakenly used to think that late feudal absolutism, the absolutism of early modern Europe, is in some sense a bourgeois regime. I think that's wrong. It is a feudal regime. It's a regime of the feudal aristocracy. But it incorporates so much of the bourgeois organizations that the underlying classical feudal ideas are undermined and muddled and confused. And the consequence of that, actually, in the first phase, not the first phase, the second phase of the bourgeois revolution, the Dutch, by mass action, seize back their urban corporations. The Dutch bourgeoisie seizes back their urban corporations by mobilizing the masses to take these corporations back as an instrument of struggle against Spanish absolutism. Very much the same thing happens in 1638 to 1641. There is a wave of mass picketing of borough elections. In London, the pro-feudal regime in the City of London is thrown out in 1638-41 by these mass mobilizations, and the City of London becomes, as it is down to this day, in fact, an organizational instrument of the bourgeoisie as a class, in spite of having been unambiguously for a couple of hundred years before that an instrument through which the feudal ruling class ruled the bourgeoisie. And the side consequence of that, out of that process, the feudal elite needs to do more to subordinate the bourgeoisie to itself. And we get, both in England in the period of counter-revolution in the 1660s, 1670s, 1680s, the Crown launches a great offensive to take away borough charters and impose its own nominees on the boroughs. In France, we see what would have happened in England if that had been successful, if it hadn't been the case that the Dutch infantry, like Soviet tanks, came over the border and overthrew the counter-revolution. Which is what we see is that the the French urban corporations, is also true of the German urban corporations in the 18th century, are no longer in any sense representatives of the bourgeoisie. They are composed of officiers or officials appointed by the state, the central state apparatus. It won't do, however, to say, okay, so then we can take back the Labour Party and the trade unions. As, in the first place, the French and the Germans didn't succeed in taking back their organisations. But secondly, actually, if you ask why the British and the Dutch did succeed in taking back, the bourgeoisie did succeed in taking back their organisations, was because they constructed an ideologically new organisation, Calvinism. And it was the Calvinist organisations which mobilised the forces which allowed that struggle to take place. Okay, so the framework, this is a framework for understanding. As a ruling class generally declines, a new class rises up. This is a spontaneous process, a process produced by the economic dynamics of class society. The new class sets up organisations which are in the first place revolutionary, but these organisations are then incorporated into the methods of rule of the old ruling class, which at the same time makes concessions as part of this process of incorporation. The concessions denature the old system of rule, and at a relatively late stage of the decline of the old system of rule, what becomes necessary is counter-reformation, is the reform in order to increase direct state and ideological control of the organisations which have been created by the rising class. It's that phase of counter-reformation which is the phase which we have been in since approximately the late 1970s, the turn to neoliberalism, financialisation, and so on and so forth. So the underlying structural dynamic, Labour Party created by the working class as an instrument of struggle, Labour parties, socialist parties, indeed communist parties in Latin America, becomes incorporated through concessions made by the bourgeoisie. Those concessions actually tend to undermine the power of the bourgeoisie, but nonetheless leave the bourgeois state in place. The bourgeois state moves to reorder society, to more bourgeoisify it, but in reality, of course, it can't do it. All it can do is statise it, create it into a increasingly state-controlled operation. Now look at the second phase of the point about this. The political representation of the working class in capitalism is inevitable. But that political representation of the working class can perfectly well be by capitalist parties, and not even just only by liberal or left-wing capitalist parties. It's more common, it's easier for the working class to adhere to the Democrats or the radicals or the liberals in England than it is to adhere to Tories, but that you can perfectly well have Tory or equivalent parties, right-wing nationalist parties, parties of order, which say we're going to make big concessions to the working class. In the 1840s, the Tories forced through bills limiting working hours, the working length of the working day. In the 1870s, 1880s, we get Joseph Chamberlain's, I can't remember what it was called, Tory democracy. Tory democracy? Which was precisely designed to appeal to at least sections of the working class. Peronism, similarly, Peronism is not a left-wing formation. Peronism is a right-wing formation which has hegemonized for the last 60 years the Argentinian trade union movement. So it is perfectly possible, and it is a natural result, that the interests of the working class will be in some way reflected in capitalist politics. For the idea of a workers' party is the idea of the working class organising itself to choose its own interests and to represent its own interests. And that is a matter of consciousness. It is not to step all the way to full class consciousness, to the working class becoming conscious of itself as a potential ruling class, as a class which could take over. But it is a step towards class consciousness, that the working class becomes conscious that it needs its own party through which it can take its own decisions. The idea of a workers' party, and I will not use the expression the Lenin formula comes conscious, this conscious, Lenin-Kautsky formula, this consciousness comes to the working class from the outside, because there's a great ambiguity about it, because basically because Chartism doesn't seem to, left Chartism and the idea of an independent workers' party doesn't seem to be a creation of intellectuals. But then when it came back after the defeat of Chartism, when the idea of an independent working class political party came back into England, it certainly came into the English labour movement from the outside, from Marxism and from the growth, phenomenal growth of the German Social Democratic Party. That phenomenal growth, first, that influence, that outside influence, first finds expression in the growth of socialist organisations, which are initially small socialist organisations, like Hindman's Social Democratic Federation from the 1880s, and from the late 1880s, Keir Hardie and Co.'s Scottish Labour Party, which became the Independent Labour Party, William Morris's Socialist League, the Delayonist Socialist Labour Party, which emerged in approximately the same period, mainly in Scotland. Initially small organisations, and those small organisations propagate the idea of an independent working class party. They spread that idea. Okay, the objective circumstances tend towards the idea in the sense that the period between the 1873 crash and the 1890s is one in which the bourgeoisie is decreasingly willing to make concessions because the underlying economic conditions are ones of slow growth, and there is a certain considerable degree of intensity of conflict between the trade unions and capital. But that in itself does not make the conditions, does not create a workers' party. The idea of a workers' party has to come in and has to be spread and has to be grasped. And by the late 1890s, the socialist groups were beginning to take substantial votes off the Liberal Party in local elections, and were beginning to win substantial votes in the trades unions and in the TUC. This is what this stuff of Engels about the bourgeois Labour Party, meaning the trade union right-wingers, is about. So in 1900, the two tendencies come together. The small socialist groups trying to achieve an independent mass workers' party, and the Lib Labs, the trade union leaders who wanted to support labour representation within the Liberal Party, trying to fend off the threat of the creation of a German-style Social Democratic Party. So that the Labour Representation Committee is created on that basis, and then it becomes a reality in terms of parliamentary representation through a secret deal between Ramsay MacDonald and the leadership of the Liberal Party, in which the Liberal Party stood down to allow Labour Party candidates to be elected in a number of constituencies. Those Labour Party candidates then, when sitting in Parliament, and this was true right down to the middle of the First World War, consistently voted with the Liberals. They didn't formally take the Liberal whip, but on every question other than trade union questions, they voted with the Liberal Party. It was a Lib Lab. The Labour Party before 1918 was a Lib Lab party. And it wasn't a mass party either. It was a a party which existed in the form of the Independent Labour Party, and then the Hindmanites were out from 1906 and then back in from 1913, the BSP. You know. But the party did not have an independent membership. It had simply the affiliated trade unions and the affiliated socialist groups. As a result of the Russian Revolution, there was a mass radicalisation. Going along with that, there was the shop stewards movement, Glasgow rent strikes, all of this stuff, the creation of a thing called a Soviet, which in classic British form actually was a large rally in Sheffield. Classic British left, call it, have a large rally and call it a conference, have a large rally and call it a Soviet. There was a high level of radicalisation, and therefore it was necessary to go one step further than the Lib Lab leadership had gone with the formation of the Labour Party, and turn it into a mass membership party. Partly, of course, that was a classic, the membership has failed us, we must elect a new membership, because it turned out that both the SDF and the ILP were anti-war, so the pro-war leadership were having difficulty in finding people to do the job for them in the constituencies. And in effect, therefore, Labour comes into existence, again, carefully with a Lassalle formulation of its aims drawn from Lassalle as opposed to Marx by Sidney Webb, carefully, actually with bans and prescriptions from the outset. There was never any question, it's not the case that the BSP walked out of the Labour Party, voluntarily walked out of the Labour Party. It was perfectly clear that the Communist Party was never going to be allowed to affiliate to the Labour Party. But nonetheless, what you get is that one step further away from Lib-Labism, that we get an independent Labour Party with a mass membership in each constituency and a mass vote, which is a working class vote, funding which is fundamentally funding from the trade unions and funding from the membership. Yeah. But it's a very right-wing party, no question about it. It's, you know, it's as right-wing a party in its early history as the Blairites are now. But that right-wing party is nonetheless, you know, a step forward relative to masses of workers voting for the Liberals or voting for the Conservatives. It is a step forward in terms of class independence. It's a contradiction. In fact, it's a contradiction within a contradiction, because the existence of a workers' party within capitalism is a contradiction within capitalism, which expresses the decline of capitalism. The existence of a bourgeois workers' party is a contradiction within the idea of a workers' party, which expresses the interest of capital within the workers' movement, within the decline of capitalism. Those contradictions, that nested set of contradictions, has a number of consequences. The first is there are episodically left-right battles. We shouldn't overestimate the episodic left-right battles, because actually if we look at the history of them, overwhelmingly they occur in periods when the old Communist Party is in relatively strong position, the exception being the 1970s, 1980s, where they're an effect of the student radicalisation of 1968 and the fact of vast numbers of people who've been around the periphery of the far left going into the Labour Party, or were in the far left for that matter. So there's left-right battles. Secondly, however, and this is, I think, fundamental, the Labour Party is capable of shifting a hell of a long way to the opposition, to the left in opposition, as well as shifting a hell of a long way to the right in government. And the far left, it seems to me, has been repeatedly wrong-footed by this. They don't, first off, the Labour Party goes into opposition and they don't expect that the Labour Party will suddenly become people who turn up on picket lines, people who call for demonstrations, people who come and make radical speeches at demonstrations. It's surprising. For some reason, every time it happens, the far left is surprised, and some part of the far left says, oh, a big movement is happening in the Labour Party, we should all go and join the Labour Party and Labour Party entry. Then, phase the next, the Labour Party approaches government, everything quietens down, the Labour Party wins government, and the trade union bureaucracy turns off the class struggle, like the mass extra-parliamentary struggle, like a tap. And the far left never expects. You always get significant extra-parliamentary struggle under the Tory government, and then it's always just turned off, bang, like that, under the most right-wing possible Labour governments, and the far left is always surprised by it. And that movement to and fro of laborism, that laborism can move to the left and move to the right, is always the far left gets caught out by and surprised by. I don't know why. I think probably because they're not grasping this contradictory character of Labour. The third element of the concession, of the contradiction, is that the Labour Party has to be very bureaucratic. Has to be very bureaucratic centralist. I guess any British party looks pretty bureaucratic centralist by comparison with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. But the Labour Party, in spite of the fact that the Tories have adopted some Labour features, the reality is that the Tory Party is almost anarchistic by comparison with the Labour Party, and the Lib Dems also very little degree of central control. Why do we have to have that degree of central control? We have to have that degree of central control because there is a contradiction that the membership wants to represent the independent interests of the working class, however confused their ideology, but the bureaucracy is pursuing the interests of the British capitalist class. And we therefore have to have highly centralised bureaucratic control to keep the lid on that contradiction. And Bournemouth, the Bournemouth conference, which took away the right to put motions to Labour Party conference, which a good many of the left have said, oh, well, that's the last step, Labour is becoming a bourgeois party. Actually, it's in completely the opposite. It demonstrates that the Blairites couldn't trust the membership to keep on message. And the fact that the Blairites couldn't trust the membership to keep on message precisely demonstrates the contradiction which is still there at the heart of the Labour Party, that it is a bourgeois workers' party. If we look then, take a step back, ask the question, where's the money coming from? Okay, the Blairites tried to make the Labour Party into the Democratic Party, and as part of that process they did actually succeed, probably because the Tories were so unpopular in the 1990s, they succeeded in getting a lot of money from big capital between roughly 1995 and 2003. But then the money dried up. Why is big capital's not stopped funding the Democratic Party? Why has big capital stopped funding the Labour Party? And the corollary of that is that most of the bloody funds of the Labour Party come from the trade unions. It's not the case that the trade unions, people talk about it, the trade unions have been disenfranchised in the Labour Party. It's bullshit. The Labour Party is the political representative of the trade union bureaucracy. The bureaucracy has its hands on the finances, its fingers on the financial throat of the Labour Party. It chooses to say, okay, go ahead, you can be as right-wing as you like. We prefer to have Blairism. The Labour trade union leadership, it's not Blairism has imposed itself in despite of the trade union leadership. The trade union leadership has imposed Blairism in despite of its own membership and and also probably in despite of the rank and file of the Labour Party. Again, if we look at the class base, can compare again the Democratic Party. The caste base of the Democratic Party, which has trade unions attached to it, in effect, indirectly, etc., the actual class base of the Democratic Party is broadly the same as that of the Liberals or the Tories in this country. It extends into the petty bourgeoisie, both in the sense of the small businesses and in the sense of the employed middle class, the professionals, etc., etc., etc. Witness, again, Connecticut votes Democrat in spite of being one of the richest parts of the United States. Okay, not enormously surprising, but if you say, is Buckinghamshire going to vote Labour? Yeah. You've got a different socio-political relationship. The Labour Party is not a straightforward bourgeois party. It is a bourgeois workers' party. Again, actually, if you look at the activists and so on, the activists, the electoral base, all of these patterns, the Labour Party displays the characteristics of a bourgeois workers' party. Okay, so how will Labour be overcome? How will Labour cease to be a bourgeois? How will Labour cease to be a bourgeois workers' party or be replaced? Two sides of the issue. First, it's clearly the Blairites wanted to make the Labour Party into the Democratic Party, and they failed. By around 2003, 2004, they had failed decisively. The question of the Labour Party ceasing to exist as a bourgeois workers' party is posed, but the way in which it's posed is the possibility that the Labour Party's vote will collapse so far in the 2010 general election, and that the Labour Party's organisation will collapse so far that Labour will no longer be a credible contender, and that the trade unions will all do as Bob Crow has done and start saying, oh well, perhaps we should vote for Plaid here, perhaps we should vote for Lib Dems here, there, perhaps we should vote for Greens here, and then the Labour Party ceases to exist in its present form. That is actually not in the interests of the working class or of communists. It's not in the interests of the working class, because that sort of development that the Labour Party evaporates and ceases to exist is a political regression in class consciousness relative to the existence of the Labour Party. It means that broad masses of the working class have become to think that they are adequately represented by one or another bourgeois party. That would be a defeat for us. The other way of overcoming the Labour Party is an advance in class consciousness. That sufficient numbers of people have to be won to a more fully class political independence than the very limited partial class political independence coupled with class collaborationism and imperialism reaction and so on represented by the Labour Party. It is an illusion to suppose that this is a spontaneous, it's a complete illusion to suppose this is a spontaneous process. It's an illusion, Comrade Stuart King said last night, this is all what people learn through doing. What that means is they learn through doing. We create an organisational split in the Labour Party and it will spontaneously become non-Labourist. The Labour Party was not created spontaneously. It was created by the combination of the objective dynamics and the objective dynamics favouring the creation of a Labour Party and the conscious action of small group, minority groups of organised socialists. The Labour Party will not be overcome similarly in a spontaneous process. And it's the idea of overcoming the Labour Party in a leftist direction in a spontaneous process is an illusion. At the end of the day, overcoming the Labour Party rests on the willingness of the left as a whole, the organised far left to intervene both inside and outside the Labour Party in its own name to defend communism. As long as the far left continues to intervene to defend laborism, the Labour Party will not be overcome in a leftwards direction. And I think no to EU is the classic example of this. If no to EU, let us imagine for the moment that no to EU, yes to democracy had taken a mass vote rather than a trivial, I think it was 1%. That would represent a regression in class consciousness. Because no to EU, yes to democracy did not claim to be an independent party of the working class, did not claim to represent the independent interests of the working class. It claimed to represent the unity of the British nation behind British democracy and British self-determination as they supposedly existed before our entry into the European Union in 1972. So that actually, I mean, in reality, the call for vote no to EU is in substance Bob Crow saying to the British working class, vote UKIP. And the British working class, not the high, it's not true that the British working class did vote UKIP, but in effect, no to EU was a campaign in favour of UKIP. So actually that sort of campaigning, and the same is true of respect in a different way, because respect, we identified respect as a cross-class bloc, rainbow coalition, deliberately representing itself as a rainbow coalition. If these phenomena were successful as cross-class blocs, rainbow coalitions, they would tend towards the overcoming of the Labour Party in a bourgeois direction, towards the liquidation of the element of class consciousness, which is that the working class needs an independent workers' political party. Overcoming that in the interests of reliance on the bourgeoisie, which is not desperately surprising because, of course, a lot of the People's Front line, which is at the back of the Communist Party of Britain, Morning Star's line, and for that matter, the back of George Calloway's line, in Italy, has indeed led to the liquidation of the Communist Party of Italy, its merger with the parties at the centre, as if the Labour Party were to liquidate its separate existence and merge with the Liberal Party, Lib Dems. That's the logic of this class collaborationist project. This sort of class collaborationist project is to reduce class consciousness, and so these, as I said, just to sum it up, the Labour Party is still a bourgeois workers' party. Its dynamics, its socio-political character, its bureaucratism, its dependence on the trade unions, its presence as a contradiction, that is all still the case. The fact it's very right-wing, that's not desperately surprising. It's been very right-wing in the past. Its being a bourgeois workers' party is a conquest of the British working class, that the British working class, that a significant section of the British working class has the idea of independent workers' political representation in Britain. But at the same time, it's also, the Labour Party is a bourgeois workers' party, an instrument of the bourgeoisie within the workers' movement. We can overcome this contradiction, but in order to overcome this contradiction, we have to fight for communism as communists, not to fight labour fakery, create labour fakery, broad fronts, halfway houses, blah blah, this sort of the other. And actually what we do if we engage in this fakery of pretending to be Labour and pretending to be, and putting forward class collaborationist, British nationalist, pseudo-Labour projects, is actually we undermine the class conquest represented by the idea of a Labour Party. We move towards simply the British working class placing its reliance on one or another section of bourgeois politicians.